This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's event with Professor Stephen Millard, who is the Interim Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research in the UK. He's joining us today to give us an update on the outlook for the UK economy. As we mentioned earlier, before the call started, a lot of us, including myself, maybe haven't been paying as much attention as we should to the UK economy recently, given risks emanating from the West. But it's always important to have a grasp of what's happening in the UK economy for Irish business. And we very much look forward to hearing Stephen's views over the course of the next hour. So as usual, we'll have a 25-minute presentation. Stephen has slides he'll share with us. We'll have questions and answers over the remaining half an hour or so. So at any time you want to put your questions in, use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll come to those later in the session. This is all on the record, as usual, both the presentation and the Q&A. So with that, a very warm welcome, Stephen, to the IIEA, and we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's an absolute pleasure to be presenting to the IIEA today. And it's quite an auspicious time with Liberation Day, as it's been called over in the States, coming in 2 days' time. And of course, that's going to have a major impact on both the Irish and the UK economies. But we'll get to that in a little bit. I'm going to attempt to share my slides, and hopefully all will be well. Great. Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can see my title slide. This is on the outlook for the UK economy. I should say it's based on work done by all of my colleagues at NIESR. It's not just me. So I'd like to publicly thank my colleagues for the hard work they've put in. This is based to a large degree on the National Institute's UK Economic Outlook that we published in February. There's a copy of the cover on the slide. But there is a little bit of an update because we had the spring statement last week, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so what are my key messages, if you like? We think that GDP in the UK is going to grow at around about 1.5% this year, and that's driven primarily by the already announced increases in government spending. They were announced in the October budget. There's been a little bit of a rollback as a result of the spring statement. We'll come back to that. But of course, there's a huge risk to that forecast for GDP growth coming from across the pond. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. In terms of inflation, we're expecting quite a large pickup in inflation in April. We expect it to stay above target throughout 2025 and most of 2026 before it comes back to target. The labour market in the UK, that remains tight. Wage growth likely to remain relatively high. And the final point I'm going to talk about the spring statement is we desperately need to rethink the UK's fiscal framework. Okay, so starting with output and GDP. So we think GDP growth will average 1.5% in both 2025 and 2026. And that's driven by the policies that were announced in the October budget. We think that those policies are going to boost growth in the short run, partly crowd out private sector investment, but only partly. From 2027 and beyond, we expect business investment to drive growth as the initial stimulus from the government fades. But there is, of course, a huge downside risk to all of this from tariffs. If I compare our forecast for GDP against those of the OBR and the Bank of England, you'll note we're actually quite optimistic about this coming year, 2025. The Bank of England, the OBR, much more pessimistic. They're expecting growth of around about 1% over the course of the year. And I think that reflects a different view as to the timing of the fiscal expansion, that we think this fiscal expansion will kick in the second half of this year, and that'll push up growth. whereas the OBR and the Bank of England are expecting the expansion to more kick in, if you like, next year in 2026. The OBR, interestingly, are much more optimistic than either us or the Bank of England, indeed, around trend growth. The OBR think that UK's trend growth is up around about 1.75%. We in the bank probably nearer to somewhere between 1.25% and 1.5%. So it'd be, of course, that really matters for what the OBR does, in that they're just judging fiscal sustainability. And obviously, the higher is trend growth, the more sustainable is fiscal policy, is any given fiscal policy in the long run. But we shall see on that. The big thing is, of course, what will happen come Liberation Day on Wednesday. Well, we're pretty sure that President Trump will put on large tariffs across the world. We're not 100% sure exactly what the numbers will be. We'll find that out. So what we did while we were preparing our outlook back in February was we just picked an example, and we picked what we thought would be a quite harsh example, but actually it's looking like the tariffs may even be worse than this. Anyway, the example we chose was 60% tariff on China and 10% on everyone else, and that applying on goods, all goods and services. We expect that we did two experiments, one with a permanent tariff, the second where the tariff was reduced after 5 years. These lines show the effect on the UK under different tariff scenarios. We think the UK GDP could fall by around about 2.5% after 3 years if tariffs of the size 10% on all countries are imposed. Of course, if tariffs are higher, the fall in UK GDP could be larger. We actually looked at the effect of the UK retaliating. It doesn't make much difference, actually, and certainly not for the first 3 years or so. So this would suggest that Keir Starmer's proposed policy of maybe not retaliating wouldn't be such a crazy thing to do in the UK's case. If the tariff was expected to be temporary, then the fall in GDP would be much less, as you might expect. Okay, moving on to inflation and monetary policy. As I say, we expect inflation to pick up in April. It's going to be around about 2.8% in Q1 of this year, and we think around 2.5% for 2025 as a whole. We expect the rise in national insurance contributions and the national living wage to exert upward pressure on prices. They're going to keep inflation high. Add to that the rises in energy prices, in water bills, and in council tax announced, or that have been announced, that will kick in April of this year. And inflation could, if anything, go higher. From late 2026 onwards, we kind of trust the Bank of England to do its job. We think you can do a lot worse than just forecasting inflation to be on target. But there are, of course, upside risks to all of this. Domestic wage inflation, global trade uncertainty. These tariffs, again, could quite likely increase inflation above where we currently think it will be. If I compare our forecast with the Bank of England and the OBRs, their forecasts for inflation this year and into the beginning of 2026 are higher than ours, and that reflects a different view over the rises in future energy prices and other utility prices, as well as the effects of the national insurance and national living wage. The bank and the OBR expect energy price rises to be larger and to be more persistent than we do, and they expect more of an effect coming through from the labour market cost increases. But the good thing is that everyone expects inflation to be back at target by late 2027. What does this all mean for monetary policy? Well, with the inflationary pressures there in the economy and the bank not expecting inflation to come down until 2027, it's very unlikely that we're going to see any further cuts in interest rates anytime soon. We think there'll be one further cut at some point this year, followed by one more in 2026. Now, whether that cut will come in May or August or even November, we'll just have to wait and see. Our suspicion is it'll come later in the year, given where the bank is currently with its inflation forecast. The key drivers here are persistent inflation and elevated wage growth. These are both likely to cause the Bank of England the Monetary Policy Committee to wait their hand in May. And as I said, we only expect one cut for the rest of the year. Beyond those two cuts that we have, one later this year, one next year, scope for further rate cuts limited. We think there's been an increase in what you might call the natural rate of interest, R star, fiscal loosening across the world, higher government debt, higher borrowing, the risks coming from trade and global dissavings generally. We think that's all going to push R star upwards. And so we're expecting interest rates to settle at only 4% now, as opposed to the 3.25% that we had thought when we last looked at this last year. Turning to the labour market, as I said, wage growth is upward of 4% for both this year and next, and that's driven by a tight labour market. Hold on. Apologies for that. Labour market tightness here, the chart on the right, this depicts the ratio of vacancies to unemployment. And as you can see, this is higher, still higher than its average over the 2001 to 2024 period. So that's why we expect continued upward pressure on wages. Looking at the unemployment rate, it was 4.4% in the 3 months to January. We expect it to nudge up just a little to 4.5%, as hikes in national insurance contributions and the national living wage are partially offset by an increase in labour demand from the public sector. The Bank of England are more pessimistic than us. They expect unemployment to rise further towards 5%. The OBR actually expect unemployment to fall towards 4%. We're slap bang in the middle. Our view is that the natural rate of unemployment is around about 4.5%, and that's why we expect it to continue at around about that rate from 2026 on. Now, as I said, the big event in the UK last week was the Chancellor's spring statement. So I thought I'd say a few things on that. But I first want to make the following point. The current UK fiscal framework puts the emphasis on the constraints on fiscal policy rather than the objectives. We have these fiscal rules that say the government has to do X, Y, and Z in order to achieve its debt and deficit targets. Now, the debt and the deficit are not what fiscal policy is about. Fiscal policy is about using the government spending and the taxation system to improve the lives of the citizens of your country. That's what fiscal policy should be about. And that's what we, NIESR, would like to see emphasized much more in a more sensible fiscal framework. The trouble with fiscal frameworks that are based purely on debt and deficit rules are that, particularly if you're running very tight, very close to those debt and deficit rules, slight changes in economic circumstances mean you have to respond immediately, and you have to respond actually in the wrong direction. We had a slight downgrade to the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecast for growth. And what did that mean? That meant that the Chancellor had to announce spending cuts between budgets, something she did not want to do. And in particular, we saw a £4.8 billion cut in welfare spending, which of course will reduce personal income and so consumption, at a time when growth prospects, if anything, have been revised down. What these cuts will not do is improve the UK's trend rate of growth. Nor, ironically, does it place the public finances on a fundamentally more sustainable path. The OBR forecast that debt will be falling, or rather that the government has £9 billion of fiscal space 5 years down the track. 6 months ago, it forecast that they had £9 billion more fiscal space 5 years down the track. But neither of those statements really say anything about the long-run sustainability of public finances. So, the end of the spring statement, it's not at all clear that the public finances were any more sustainable than they were at the beginning of the spring statement, despite the fact that the rules in place forced the Chancellor to make £4.8 billion worth of welfare cuts. So we very much think it's time to change that framework. One thing that was announced in terms of increase was defence spending. The Chancellor announced a £6.4 billion increase in defence. Defence spending by 2029 to 2030. This will, of course, boost GDP in the short run by increasing demand, may have a longer run impact on GDP through increasing the supply capacity of the economy. If the investment in defence has spillovers in the private sector, or indeed crowds in private sector investment spending, then we could see an increase in the economy's potential GDP. We ran the increase through our model, NIGEM, and we actually saw an increase in potential GDP of something like 0.075%. So it's not much, it's not big, but there may be that positive effect. I should say, when it was announced in the spring statement, I raised a little cheer. My hometown is Portsmouth, and the Portsmouth dockyard was in fact name-checked in the spring statement. So my hometown should benefit a little bit from this. Okay, let's return to the rules. This is a chart of the public sector net financial liabilities to GDP ratio, including our forecast and the OBR. We're pretty much in the same place on this. We think the government's on track to meet its fiscal rule. Public sector net financial liabilities should be falling as a percentage of GDP by 2029-30. Strong GDP growth and persistent inflation, that's what's helping to drive down this ratio. But of course, rising borrowing costs are acting as a real constraint on fiscal policy at the minute. With the debt to GDP ratio on this measure up around 80% or so, then interest payments on the debt are going to be large. And that seems a good point at which to bring my talk to an end and take questions. Just to summarize again, the key messages. GDP growth, we think it's going to be 1.5% this year, driven by the increases in government spending. But, it could be a lot lower if these tariffs really go through to at the extent that President Trump has promised. We think inflation is going to rise in April and remain above target for the rest of the year, but we think it's broadly under control. Again, the Trump tariffs, likely to be announced on Wednesday, are gonna mean that inflation will be higher, but what that will translate into is interest rates being held higher for longer by the Bank of England. We think the labour market remains tight and wage growth high. We think wage growth will remain above 4%. If we do the back of the envelope calculation of 2% inflation target plus, say, 1.5% productivity growth, that means wages are still higher, or wage growth is still higher than is compatible with an inflation target of 2%. And finally, we need to rethink the UK fiscal framework. The events of last week, the spring statement, made absolutely clear that these fiscal rules, which are essentially arbitrary and are also self-imposed by the government, have the result of forcing the government to make changes to its spending plans, which might not necessarily have any positive effect on the long-run sustainability of the public finances. This is clearly not a good position to be in, and it definitely needs a rethink. And that's it. More than happy to take any questions on anything I've talked about, or indeed any aspect of the UK economy. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.